And who has a better story than Bran the Broken?
Oh,
It doesn't feel right.
you said it, pal. Yeah, I know, another Game of Thrones video. In fairness though, this channel has Hollywood in the name, so it'd be odd if I didn't say something about it, and while only a couple of people and their dog may have seen it, I made a post on Minds a couple of years ago defending Season 7, and you can understand why I just can't leave it at that. Originally I was planning to make a video about Episode 3, I had a photo ready and everything, but real life stuff in the meat space kept me out of the game for some time, during which GOT bashing suddenly became the new Last Jedi bashing. Mauler et al. Covered pretty much all of the points I was going to make about The Long Night. Quick Mauler impression, why? Just, fuck you, adaption. And since then, every episode has been seized upon and ripped apart by YouTubers both big and formerly small, who have fattened themselves on the show's carcass, and fair play to them. So, since I prefer not to just plough the same furrow as everyone else, and Benioff and Weiss's blunders are so apparent that even normies who typically lap up any old slop have been unable to miss them, I'm going to focus, a la Elliot Carver, not so much on the what here as the why. Why were these two gentlemen, whose carefully crafted air of lofty professionalism positively invites ridicule, given control of what became the biggest show on television, and then permitted to crash the whole fucking thing into the sun? First though, I should explain my history with the show. What got me to watch it were, honestly, the giant posters of a moody-looking Sean Bean that appeared all over the place before Season 1. If memory serves, there was one at London Bridge that you couldn't fail to notice. I'd been a fan of Mr. Bean since the days of Sharp, and the prospect of him yelling, "Outside! Now!" to his rivals in a medieval setting was pretty appealing. Of course, that's not quite what the show turned out to be, but hey. What kept me watching were the same things that kept everyone watching, and in particular the political machinations. I may be the only person who, upon reading the bit about taxation and the title crawl for The Phantom Menace back in '99, was like, fucking hell, George, yes! Take me to that subcommittee! I love me some politicking, and Game of Thrones was a show in which just about everyone, aside from poor Ned, though he of course had his own big secret, was pursuing some hidden agenda, and in many cases had been since long before some of the main characters were even born. The complex interplay of these agendas, coupled with the fact that, yes, anyone could die, made for a captivating series. The fantasy elements, frankly, were of less interest to me, but I wasn't averse to them, and once they'd been established I expected and desired them to be of overriding importance in the final reckoning. I didn't and still haven't read the books, though at one point I did make a start on the first one. With apologies to GRRM fans, while I don't doubt he's a master at world building and plotting, up to a point anyway, and possibly dialogue to boot, I just wasn't enamoured of his prose style. Though to be fair, when in preparation for this I took another look at the first few chapters to find an example of what I disliked, I couldn't find anything that objectionable, aside perhaps from a J.K. Rowling-ish tendency to use a million different terms for said. So maybe I judged him unfairly, and maybe I will give the books another go. Although given how the man seems likelier to die of a hot dog-induced heart attack than to finish another instalment in the series, maybe not. Anyway, the point is I loved the show, and I hadn't read the books, so when the former began diverging from the latter, I didn't know what I was missing out on. I also had no sense of how utterly reliant on GRM the showrunners were. When, during Season 7, I became aware that a lot of people thought the series had gone downhill, I was still very much on board. In my Minds post I addressed 3 specific complaints. The first was that travel times had become virtually non-existent. Actually, I didn't address that one, I merely dismissed it as a bit jarring. Never mind. The second was that the anyone can die policy had apparently been abandoned. This I justified by arguing that it would probably be reinstated before long, and if major characters such as Jaime had been killed off so close to the end, without completing their arcs, it would, to quote myself, have rendered a fair chunk of the show essentially pointless. I think I had a point there, though a premature death, even at that late stage, needn't necessarily have been a bad thing, provided the character's actions continued to have an effect on the wider narrative. In real life, individual stories are rarely wrapped up in a neat little bow. The third criticism was that the writers fucked up Littlefinger by having him basically just hang around Winterfell accomplishing nothing before dying stupidly. In hindsight, like Littlefinger, I should have smelt a rat, but here's how I defended it. What more motivation did he need to stay put than wanting to bang Sansa and effectively become the king in the north if JS died, which, given the way he carries on, was not unlikely? Was he supposed to go back to the Eyrie and skulk around there? LF, the TV version at least, I've not read the books yet, was a gambler. It was all or nothing for him. I should have been less forgiving of the writers having a master manipulator, the master manipulator, suddenly mark time and lose his instinct for survival. Yes, Littlefinger was a gambler, and whenever you gamble, eventually you lose, but he wouldn't and shouldn't have just stopped like that. Apart from being boring to watch, it was, of course, out of character. Littlefinger's end should have come as a result of him being out-Littlefingered, double-crossed by someone he was planning to double-cross, say, or through simple, ironic bad luck. I was subconsciously cutting the show some slack because it had previously delivered such unforgettable moments as the Oberyn v Mountain fight. God, was that awesome. I remember during the week beforehand speculating as to whether Oberyn or the Mountain would win and thinking that neither result felt right. And lo and behold, they both won, and lost, an outcome I wasn't expecting but which, in retrospect, felt not only right but inevitable. That's good writing. From the books, of course. But I digress. Then came Season 8. Damn it, I was okay with the first 2 episodes. Well, mostly. Sure, pretty much everyone was now marking time, but the focus on the characters and their interactions still seemed laudable in an age when characterization too often consists of throwaway lines between fight scenes, and it served to get viewers back up to speed after a long break. And yet something bothered me, and that was Tyrion's repetition of the line about dying with his cock in a girl's mouth. Up until then, I guess I thought that Tyrion had merely been off his game lately and would inevitably reclaim his position as the smartest man alive, as Sansa put it. But now he not only seemed less intelligent, he was actually dull. The Tyrion of old would never have bored us with a joke we'd heard already. This was a clear case of the writers being lazy, of throning it in, if you will. However, with the following episode promising to deliver the most epic battle yet, a battle we'd been building up to since the very start, I let it slide. You know what happened next. For some, the moment of realisation came seasons earlier. For some, it may have occurred later in the episode. But for me, the final straw, the thing that finally caused the scales to fall from my eyes, was the Dothraki charge. Jesus titty fucking Christ. Charging all your cavalry at the front of the enemy's infantry, who not only massively outnumber you but are concealed by darkness, like fucking everything else, oh, and with the ludicrously exposed trebuchets firing just ahead of them, is just staggeringly, monumentally, suicidally stupid. And if there's any idiot out there who thinks taking issue with the tactics employed in a battle on a TV show is autistic, no, sorry, I'm not having it. This scene made it abundantly clear that Benioff and Weiss have no understanding of how battles were fought, no interest in military history, and for the people in charge of a medieval drama series featuring many battles, and which for all its fantastical elements was always grounded in gritty reality, that's simply inexcusable. What did they have to say about it again?
We wanted our characters to feel like maybe this is all going to work out, maybe things are all going to be okay.
Well, they wouldn't think that. Jon, Sir Davos, Sir Jorah, Jaime, Brienne, Grey Worm, Ed, all are experienced soldiers and all would have been aware of the stupidity of this charge. They would have known it was doomed to failure, flaming scythes or no.
We've seen how devastating a Dothraki charge can be just with their regular swords, and now when they're galloping into combat with flaming Araks, it's what could possibly stand against that?
Infantry, you cretin. Lots of infantry facing towards you.
What they see is just the end of the Dothraki, essentially.
Psych! Now, I said I wouldn't dwell too much on the mistakes themselves, but I will briefly mention a few of the other gems provided by the Brothers Dim in the final 3 episodes, just so no one can claim I'm damning them without sufficient supporting evidence, even though the charge of the Can't-Write Brigade ought to be more than enough by itself. I know most, if not all of these, have already been covered elsewhere, but perhaps 1 or 2 may have gone unremarked until now. At the start of episode 4, we see scores of giant funeral pyres constructed of lots and lots of neatly chopped logs, which, unless we're to believe the survivors spent the next few days, or more likely weeks, preparing them, must surely have been available before the battle. And yet this wood wasn't used to build additional fortifications, which, as Invicta pointed out, could have been positioned so as to slow down the oncoming whites and enable the Dothraki to achieve local superiority, at least for a while. Assuming, of course, the greatest military minds in Westeros remembered to place their forces behind them, for fucks. Also at the start of that episode, Dany appears to whisper something to poor old Sajora. I'm sure the fact that we can't hear her was an artistic choice, just as all those long, silent walks in episode 6 were artistic choices. It wasn't so that Benioff and Weiss didn't have to write anything. Later, Bran is about to reveal the truth of Jon's parentage to Sansa and Arya. But we cut away, and we don't get to see their reactions to this world-shattering revelation about their sort of brother, because there's too much to do. You've got to make time for this lengthy shot of Tyrion lying on the floor and Arya's music videos. Maybe Arya's thinking about it here. At the end, Cersei doesn't have her forces ballista the fuck out of Dany's absurdly vulnerable little parley party and an equally vulnerable Drogon. Even though that would have ended the war in seconds, and she's perfectly capable of cold-blooded murder, as she proves in that scene when she has Missandei beheaded. And it definitely would have worked because ballistas are incredibly powerful and accurate. Oh, wait. In episode 5, King's Landing, which with the onset of winter has teleported to a semi-arid location, is destroyed in mere minutes by Drogon, who now might as well be a Star Destroyer, he's so OP. Also, Dany and Grey Worm are mass-murdering psychopaths now. Why can't I hold all these subverted expectations?
It's in that moment on the walls of King's Landing when she's looking at that symbol of everything that was taken from her when she makes the decision to make this personal.
By incinerating thousands upon thousands of random civilians who had nothing to do with her father's death, nor with the subsequent rulers of Westeros preventing her from seizing power until now. And given how OP Drogon is, why didn't she... Anyway. This time it's personal, Cersei. That's why I'm attacking not you. Because it's personal. In episode 6, Jon doesn't think of trying to use Drogon against the enrichment. Or get immediately killed by Grey Worm after he's, for some reason, confessed to killing Dany. Or merit even a mention when Sansa and co are considering who should be king. Or do much of anything besides trying to justify what Dany did a minute after saying he won't try to justify what Dany did, and finally sticking it to his aunt in an appropriate manner.
One of my friends sits this one out. She's just dead.
And Bran, the guy who might as well be on mushrooms 24/7, he's so divorced from reality, the guy who's less charismatic than his own wheelchair, the guy who can't even stand up, let alone lead an army, the guy who said,
I can never be lord of anything.
The guy whose sole contribution during the Battle of Winterfell was walking into a bird and flapping around for a bit, the guy who knew Theon would be okay if he just waited a few seconds yet allowed him to die, the guy who knew what would happen once Jon learned his true identity, and so could have prevented the massacre in King's Landing by simply informing Sam of the consequences of telling him, and so is either retarded or evil, that's the guy they elect as king. Smirk. There are, of course, many other issues besides, but it would take ages to go through them all, and I'm late to the party as it is. So, having established how I arrived at the realisation that Benioff and Weiss had totally fucked up the show, and I hope supplied more than enough reasons to support this assessment, let's now return to the question of why. Why were the duo former fans of Chris and Dumb and Dumber hired and not subsequently fired?
So we had messed up the most kind of obvious storytelling possibilities, and HBO, for some reason, decided to give us another chance.
Could it be because of the stellar quality of their previous work? Well, let's take a look at that, shall we? Before Game of Thrones, Benioff was a successful screenwriter, with 6 of his feature-length scripts being turned into films, 3 of which, to give the man a fair shake, I've now watched. Troy I'd already seen years ago, but I could barely remember it, so I watched it again, and I can still barely remember it. This is a loose retelling of the Iliad that removes the gods from the proceedings entirely, which is odd, turns Achilles and Hector into brooding, war-weary new men, which is odder still, and takes a genuinely amazing cast and has them play dress-up in flat, forgettable scenes that combine to form a sort of meaningless CGI-heavy froth, which is unforgivable. Honestly, how a film can feature Sean Bean, Brian Cox and Peter O'Fucking-Toole and fail to provide any of them with a single memorable line is beyond me. Rose Byrne's nose is the best thing in it, and I'm not even joking. Incidentally, re-watching the film after Game of Thrones, a couple of shots look strangely familiar. And it's interesting to note how Armour does cock all in this world too. After Troy, Benioff's best-known big-screen effort is probably X-Men Origins Wolverine, which he co-wrote. Now, I'll admit I'm not the biggest fan of cape shit, but I'm not immune to its charms where charms exist, so I gave Origins a go. And no charms existed. I'm not sure what there is to say about it, except that in spite of its name, it fails to deliver a compelling origin story. Wolverine has a psycho brother and worked with a bunch of other assholes, and the reason why he has an adamantium skeleton is that he was given it. Great. At least Benioff can't be blamed for the CGI claws, which look like something out of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. The third Benioff offering I sampled was 25th Hour, which he adapted from his debut novel and served as the foundation for his entire career. It's about a convicted New York drug dealer who's waiting to begin his prison sentence. Yes, it's a film about waiting. We got a regular Samuel Beckett here, folks. From the portentous opening titles, you can tell, even if you miss the name Spike Lee, that we're meant to regard it as a serious film that has important things to say.
It insists upon itself, Lois.
Yet for all the heavy-handed 9/11 references, it really doesn't. We follow Edward Norton's character as he experiences his last 24 hours of freedom, during which you'd expect him to reach some kind of epiphany, to achieve some measure of growth. But no, not really. The closest he gets is an acknowledgement that he had it all and threw it away, which, well, duh. At no point does he even consider the misery and death that surrounds his former occupation, let alone admit to being responsible for any of it. In fact, the film as a whole just isn't interested in the human cost of the drugs trade, reflecting, one suspects, the attitude of your average Hollywood partygoer. The fact that dealing drugs causes suffering is only mentioned by one character, a Wall Street D-bag, in passing. Meanwhile, our coke-peddling protagonist is presented as an unassuming fellow who wouldn't hurt a fly, and, in flashbacks, the DEA agents who bust him are depicted as a bunch of dicks whose sole interest is in tormenting their targets. Serious and important film, my arse. And to reiterate, nothing happens. About the only things we have to keep us going are Rosario Dawson and Anna Paquin drenched in nightclub sweat, and a bit of Brian Cox. What has Benioff done to deserve so much Cox? This film is so committed to stasis that right at the end we're shown things happening, and then it's revealed that no, they didn't actually happen. One of the best films of the decade! So yeah, that's half of Benioff's back catalogue, and even though, as with STD, there'll be people who think I should watch it all before passing judgment, come the fuck on. This calibre of work does not explain HBO's confidence in him. As for Weiss, well, it's kind of embarrassing. He doesn't really have a back catalogue. Pre-GOT, he wrote a number of screenplays, one of them with Benioff, but none were produced. The only thing we have to judge him by is his debut novel, 2003's Lucky Wonder Boy, about a 20-something video game obsessive. Here's an extract. After her chronic cough became more persistent, the doctors took x-rays and found spots in both her lungs. Further inquiries revealed that the cancer had recently metastasized to her brain, though it had not yet gotten a firm foothold there. They started her on aggressive chemotherapy, and the rest of her body deteriorated along with her tumour cells. There is no need to catalogue the details of this deterioration. You have seen it for yourself, or you will. I have nothing to add to your current or future memories, no light to shed on them, no meaning or hope to extract. Her sickness was a constant whisper in our house, even when it was not being talked about. In the living room at night you could hear my mother's murmuring remorse that she'd done nothing to stop my grandmother's smoking, or her own for that matter, and the hallway walls would carry her cries of helpless rage through my closed bedroom door. I'm not sure why only the walls were involved with the transmission of sound, and my mother's murmuring remorse that is some seriously ropey sentence construction, but even if we disregard these things, does this seem sufficiently brilliant to account for Weiss being handed joint command of an extremely expensive TV series? No. The quality of their previous work theory doesn't really fly then. That being the case, could it be that HBO execs were simply swept along by the duo's enthusiasm and then later, having realised they'd been sold a lemon, decided it'd be too expensive to get rid of them? Well, I've no idea what the details of their contracts were, but the second part seems plausible. However, enthusiasm isn't enough to explain the signing of any deal in Hollywood. Millions of wannabe novelists and screenwriters have enthusiasm. Enthusiasm won't get you past a literary agent's assistant's assistant, let alone into a pitch meeting at HBO. The question remains, why these guys? I think we all know the answer to that. Benioff and Weiss got to do what they did not because of any talent they might possess, but because of who they are. Benioff, who goes by his mother's maiden name, is the son of one Stephen Friedman, a former chairman of Goldman Sachs, and is also related to the tech billionaire Mark Benioff. Moreover, in 2006, just a few months before the announcement that he and Weiss would be writing and exec producing GOT, Benioff married the actress Amanda Peet. Weiss, meanwhile, has been friends with Benioff since 1995, when they met while studying literature, apparently, in Dublin. Oh, and they're both Jewish, as is Amanda Peet. No one with their, at best, mediocre writing abilities but without their connections would have got anywhere near running a major TV show. And as for the Jewish thing, while I don't for a minute think Jewish nepotism is the main factor in determining who succeeds and who doesn't in Hollywood, and if you don't believe me, watch this video I made last year in which I didn't utter the word Jewish once, it clearly is a factor. And to prove this, I don't have to show you one of those images so beloved of Poll of all the top media executives at companies such as Disney and CBS. I need only refer you to a Norm Macdonald joke.
Well, earlier this week, actor Marlon Brando met with Jewish leaders to apologize for comments he made on Larry King Live. Among them that, quote, Hollywood is run by Jews. The Jewish leaders accepted the actor's apology and announced that Brando is now free to work again.
Why do we laugh? Why does the audience in ultra-liberal, decidedly Jewy New York laugh? Because it's based on truth. What the Game of Thrones debacle boils down to, then, is yet more proof that Hollywood doesn't believe in meritocracy. In Hollywood, people aren't hired for their talent, but because of their race, gender, politics, and/or who they know. This has been apparent to many of us for years, of course, but what Season 8 has done, more so than even The Last Jedi perhaps, is lay bare this disgusting truth for all to see. When I was growing up in the 80s and early 90s, God I miss those times, people believed, and I was repeatedly told, that if you had a talent for something and you worked hard enough at it, then you were bound to succeed. This belief, based of course on the experiences of the boomers, was best exemplified by a line in Back to the Future.
Like I've always told you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything.
Oh, George. What was true for the boomers, broadly at least, has turned out not to be true for any subsequent generation, at least in the creative arts. If I'd known just how badly the deck would be stacked against people like me back when I was 15, I'd have ditched the humanities and gone down the maths and sciences route, instead of the other way around. I could have done that, damn it. In maths or nuclear physics or engineering or programming, a Benioff or Weiss, regardless of whom they knew, couldn't win out over talented, hard-working individuals because they couldn't keep getting away with it. If GOT were a bridge, say, and they were its designers, and somehow permitted to move beyond testing, it would have collapsed, and they wouldn't have then been allowed to go work on another bridge. The problem with writing as compared to science is that beyond the basics of spelling and sentence construction, which fewer and fewer people can manage, but that's a topic for another time, good and bad are far harder to pin down. That's not to say objectively bad writing doesn't exist, just that at first glance, to the average Joe, it rarely looks as different from good writing as 2 + 2 = 4 does from 2 + 2 = pi, or a functioning program does from Fallout 76. At a basic level, GOT's scripts contain all the things good scripts contain, nouns, verbs, adjectives, all that jazz, and are usable as things from which television can be made, so Messrs B and W get to pass off their metaphorical pile of twisted metal as a triumph and move on to Star Wars. It's like poetry. Really, really bad poetry. Doomcock has a slogan, "Without respect, we reject," referring to the lack of respect shown to traditional fans in modern TV shows and films. I think that ought to apply to what goes on behind the cameras as well, and indeed before any cameras are even set up. Without meritocracy we don't want to see, it needs work. The thing is, though, I don't believe Hollywood is capable of reform. Hollywood's idea of meritocracy would probably be a BBC-style quota system that fucked talented white guys without connections even harder and patronised everyone else, and which the usual suspects would still find ways around. I think we need a new Hollywood, and I think there's never been a better time to build one. The popularity of the Game of Thrones petition, the disparity between audience and critic scores on Rotten Tomatoes, prominent failures such as Solo and Ghostbusters 2016, the shunning of corporate content in favour of videos produced by passionate so-called amateurs on YouTube for all their efforts to force it on us, all indicate a widespread dissatisfaction with the status quo. At the same time, with HD cameras, powerful editing software and high-speed internet connections all readily available to the man or woman on the street, Hollywood's existing infrastructure isn't nearly as important as it once was. Just imagine if some enterprising billionaire, Peter Thiel, were to join forces with the likes of PewDiePie to create and popularise a sort of combined YouTube and TV network/film studio. Though the old media would undoubtedly characterise it as a far-right platform, it would be politically neutral and, besides just being a place where anyone can upload videos, serve as a meritocratic testbed for wannabe writers, actors, editors and so on. Proven talents could be offered funding for bigger projects and sought out by other talented folk, and ultimately, potentially, hired to create premium content made available, alongside shows and films from established creatives with solid track records, via a subscription service a la YouTube Premium. Or even, in some cases, sold to other networks or released in cinemas. Yes, those server farms will be expensive, but, to paraphrase Ferris Bueller's dad, you've got to spend money to make money. And, to get all reverse Steve Jobsian for a moment, do you, Mr. or Mrs. Billionaire, want to spend the rest of your life selling software, or do you want to change the world? Now, you may say we've always had shit TV and movies, and I'm overstating the importance of all this pop culture nonsense, to which I say, I've been around for a while and I don't remember things ever being this bad, and tell that to Goebbels, or Walt Disney, or Lenin, or Yuri Bezmenov, or Andrew Breitbart, or Donald Trump. You may also say that frustrated creatives should, like laid-off BuzzFeed journos, learn to code, but we can't all be coders, and with the influx of Indians et al. Into the industry, how long before that bubble bursts? Finally, you may say I'm being naive, and well, maybe so. But what's more naive? Thinking Hollywood can be replaced, or thinking it can change?
What's this? A Song of Ice and Fire.
Hey, that's the name of the books.
A quick joke for you. Who's Jon Snow's favourite actor? Steve McQueen! Hey, come on!